They say old buildings have souls, memories etched into the plaster and dust. For Sarah, a sound artist seeking solace and cheap rent after a painful breakup, the Blackwood Arms offered cavernous space at an impossible price. Its faded grandeur whispered of a bygone era, but beneath the peeling paint and echoing halls, something else stirred. Something ancient and hungry, nesting within the labyrinthine ventilation system. Soon the whispers began, insidious murmurs that knew her name, her fears, her secrets. They promised truths and offered temptations, weaving themselves into the very fabric of her sanity, demanding she listen or become another voice in the building's decaying chorus. Let's begin the story. Get comfortable and listen closely. The key turned with a reluctant screech, the heavy oak door groaning open like a tomb. Sarah wrestled her largest synth case over the threshold, the effort echoing unnaturally in the cavernous space of apartment 7B. The Blackwood Arms. Even the name felt heavy, Gothic. Online photos hadn't done justice to the sheer scale of the place. Ceilings soared 12 feet high, crowned with ornate, water-stained plasterwork. Sunlight struggled through tall, grimy windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like tiny spirits. It smelled of damp wool, old paper, and something else, a faint metallic tang underlying the mustiness. For the rent, a figure that made her pragmatic friend Jess choke over the phone, it was palatial. Or potentially haunted. Sarah chose to focus on the former. After the implosion of her relationship with Mark and the subsequent eviction from their shared overpriced superbox studio, this felt like a necessary, albeit slightly unnerving step down, or maybe sideways. It was space. Glorious, echoing space where she could finally set up her recording equipment properly, where the thrum of her bass synth wouldn't immediately summon an angry neighbor. She dropped the synth case with a thud that reverberated through the floorboards. Silence rushed back in, thick and expectant. The building itself seemed to be holding its breath. She walked through the main living area, her footsteps loud on the worn parquet flooring. A grand, non-functional fireplace dominated one wall, its marble mantel chipped. But her eyes were drawn, again and again, to the vents. They were everywhere. Large, ornate grates of wrought iron patterned with faded fleur-de-lis were set high on the walls near the ceiling and lowered down near the floorboards. One particularly large one dominated the living room wall opposite the fireplace, easily 3 feet wide. Another sat squatly in the bedroom, its metal slightly warped. Even the small bathroom had one, tucked near the ceiling tiles, coated in layers of ancient paint. They seemed disproportionately large for the era, like airways designed for something much bigger than human lungs. Dismissing a faint prickle of unease, Sarah started unpacking. Boxes labeled mics, cables, and synths were piled near the center of the room. As she set up her monitors and audio interface, connecting cables snaking across the floor, she noticed the acoustics. Strange. Certain frequencies seemed to die instantly, absorbed by the thick walls, while others, particularly lower tones, resonated with an odd, almost harmonic sustain. Ambient noise was minimal. The distant hum of city traffic was heavily muffled, leaving only the internal sounds of the Blackwood Arms. The occasional shudder of pipes, the low groan of the ancient elevator shaft somewhere down the hall, the creak of settling timbers. It was quiet, almost too quiet. Later that afternoon, hauling a box of vinyl records, she encountered him in the dimly lit hallway. He seemed to materialize from the shadows near the stairwell, a small, stooped man with rheumy eyes and clothes that might have been fashionable 60 years ago. "New tenant," he rasped, his voice dry as autumn leaves. He leaned on a cane, peering at her box. 7B, big space, lots of Air. "Hi," Sarah managed, startled. "Yes, Sarah. Just moving in." He nodded slowly, his gaze drifting towards the ornate vent grate near her apartment door. Good lungs on this old girl. Breathes deep. He tapped the wall lightly with his cane handle. Listens, too. "Gotta be careful what you say near the vents." He gave a small, unsettling chuckle that dissolved into a cough. "Just the building settling. Just the wind in her pipes." Sarah watched him go, a chill tracing its way down her spine despite the stuffy air. Eccentric old man, she told herself. Probably lonely. Still, his words echoed the unease she felt about the vents. They did seem unusually prominent, like metallic ears pressed against the walls. I imagined them connecting apartment to apartment, floor to floor, a hidden network spiderwebbing through the building's decaying structure. Exhausted by evening, Sarah ordered takeout, the delivery guy looking nervously over his shoulder as he handed her the food in the echoing lobby. She ate sitting on the floor amidst the clutter, the silence broken only by her own chewing and the building's occasional sigh. She decided against unpacking her soundproofing panels just yet. She wanted to get a feel for the apartment's natural soundscape first. Later, stretched out on her inflatable mattress in the vast bedroom, sleep wouldn't come. The city outside was a low, distant rumble. Inside, the silence felt different now, charged, watchful. She kept thinking about Henderson's words. Listens, too. Then she heard it. Faint, so faint, she almost dismissed it as her own tired mind playing tricks. It came from the direction of the living room, seemingly from the large vent grate near the floor. A soft, drawn-out exhalation, like a sigh, and woven into it, barely perceptible, a whisper. "Sarah." Her breath hitched. She sat bolt upright, straining her ears. Silence. Thick and absolute silence. Nothing but the low thrumming in her own ears, the pulse hammering against her eardrums. Slowly she got up, heart pounding. She crept into the living room, peering at the dark rectangle of the vent. Moonlight slanted through the window, catching the dust on the ironwork. Nothing. She knelt, pressing her ear close to the cold metal. Only the faintest whisper of airflow, cool against her skin. It had to be fatigue, stress, the acoustics of an old building carrying sounds from neighbors, though she hadn't heard any clear signs of life from adjacent apartments. Or maybe it was just the wind, as Henderson suggested, whistling through the ancient ductwork in a way that mimicked speech. She backed away, pulling her arms around herself. It was just the building settling, just the sounds of an old structure breathing. But as she retreated to the bedroom, she couldn't shake the feeling that something, deep within the walls, had just recognized her name. And it wasn't the wind. The whispers didn't return the next night, nor the night after. Sarah threw herself into setting up her studio, the familiar routine a comforting bulwark against the unsettling atmosphere of the Blackwood Arms. Cables were neatly routed, synths arranged, microphones placed on stands. She even hung a few prints on the vast, bare walls, trying to impose her own presence onto the gloomy space. She tested her equipment, sending pulses of sine waves and bursts of white noise into the room, listening critically to the playback, noting the strange resonant frequencies and dead spots. The building itself seemed to subtly shape the sound, adding its own character to her recordings. But the quiet moments remained unnerving. Sitting with a cup of tea in the early morning quiet or lying in bed waiting for sleep, the silence felt less like absence and more like a held breath. And then, inevitably, the whispers returned. They were never loud, never demanding attention. They were insidious, creeping in at the edges of perception, always seeming to emanate from the nearest vent when she was alone and the apartment was still. Sometimes it was just a sigh, like the first night.
Other times, isolated words surfaced from the faint, staticky murmur. Cold, breathed from the bathroom vent while she showered, the single word hanging in the steam. Here, hissed from the bedroom grate as she drifted towards sleep, pulling her instantly awake, heart hammering. Listen, whispered from the large living room vent while she was sketching out a musical idea, the sibilant sound making the pencil tremble in her hand. Sometimes it wasn't words, but fragments of sound, a faint, distorted crying that seemed miles away or a low chuckle that was dry and humorless, like rustling paper. The quality was deeply unsettling. It wasn't a single voice, but many, layered imperfectly, like a radio tuned slightly off station filtered through decades of dust and distance. It was genderless, ageless, yet carried the faint impression of countless forgotten conversations, hushed secrets, and lingering sorrows. Sarah tried to rationalize. Old pipes carrying sound, neighboring apartments with thin walls, but the whispers were too localized, too clearly tied to the vents in her apartment, and they only happened when she was alone, when the ambient noise floor was low enough for such faint sounds to be perceived. Enough was enough. One Saturday morning, fueled by coffee and frustration, she decided to take action. She found a large, sturdy cardboard box left over from the move and cut a piece to fit snugly over the main living room vent grate. Using half a roll of heavy-duty duct tape, she sealed the edges, creating an airtight barrier. There, she said aloud, the sound startlingly loud in the quiet room. Let's see you whisper through that. For a day, there was blessed silence. Sarah felt a surge of triumph. It was just drafts, weird acoustics, easily solved. She worked late into the night, feeling more relaxed than she had since moving in, losing herself in the creation of a new ambient track inspired by the building's strange sonic character. She fell asleep on the inflatable mattress, exhausted but content. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, she was jolted awake, not by a sound but by a feeling, the distinct prickling sensation of being watched. Her eyes snapped open to the darkness, and then she heard it, coming not from the sealed living room vent, but from the smaller grate near the floorboards in the bedroom, mere feet from her head. So close, it breathed, the layered voices clearer, closer than ever before. Panic seized her. She scrambled backwards, bumping against the wall. The whisper faded, replaced by the familiar low static sigh. Blocking one vent hadn't stopped it, it had merely rerouted it. Like water finding a new path, the sound, the presence, had simply emerged elsewhere. She looked around the room frantically. Were there other openings? Hairline cracks in the plaster near the vent? Was the sound somehow resonating through the metal itself? The feeling of being listened to became almost unbearable. It felt like the entire apartment, the entire building, was an enormous decaying ear and she was trapped inside its auditory canal. The next day, shaken and sleep-deprived, she called Jess. Pacing her living room, careful to keep her voice down, despite knowing her friend was miles away, she tried to explain. Jess, there's something weird going on here. The vents, I keep hearing things. Hearing things? Like what? Neighbors? Jess's voice, usually warm and sharp, was tinged with concern but grounded in practicality. You said the walls might be thin. No, not neighbors. It's like whispers coming from the vents, like inside the vents. She described the sounds, the layered quality, the feeling of being listened to. She mentioned blocking the vent and how the sound had simply moved. There was a pause on the other end. Okay, Sarah. Look, old buildings make weird noises. Drafts through ventilation systems can sound like anything, especially when you're tired or stressed. And you've been through a lot lately with Mark and the move. I'm not imagining it, Jess. It signed my name. Maybe you thought it did. Auditory pareidolia, the brain finding patterns in random noise. It happens. Or maybe it is another tenant. Someone messing with you. This place sounds kind of creepy. Maybe someone gets kicked scaring the new girl. It doesn't feel like a prank, Sarah insisted, frustration mounting. It feels old, and it knows when I'm alone. All right, Jess conceded, sensing Sarah's distress. "Just be careful, okay? Get some good earplugs maybe. Try to ignore it. If it gets worse, maybe look into breaking the lease. That place sounds like a dump anyway, even if it's big." Sarah hung up, feeling more isolated than ever. Jess meant well, but she didn't understand. How could she? It sounded crazy. Maybe it was crazy. Driven by a need for answers, Sarah turned to the internet again, digging deeper this time. She searched for Blackwood Arms Chicago strange noises, Blackwood Arms tenant complaints, history of Blackwood Arms building. Most results were just rental listings, basic architectural details, built 1922, pre-war Art Deco influences, and a few generic news snippets about its slow decline. But tucked away in obscure forums and digitized newspaper archives from decades past, she found whispers of a different kind. Vague mentions of tenants complaining about constant drafts, noises in the walls, feeling watched. One cryptic post from 10 years ago simply read, "Don't rent in the Blackwood. The walls listen." Another mentioned persistent plumbing issues and unsettling sounds from the ventilation, dismissed by management as normal for a building its age. Nothing concrete, nothing about personalized whispers or sentient ventilation systems, but it was something. A faint echo of shared experience, a hint that she wasn't the first person to feel the oppressive weight of the Blackwood Arms and its watchful, whispering airways. The static was blooming, not just in the vents, but in the building's hidden history too.
The fragile dam of Sarah's rationalizations began to crumble. The murmur, as she started thinking of it, not a ghost, not a person, but something embedded in the building's structure, was learning. Or perhaps it had always known. The whispers shifted, evolving from fragmented sounds into something chillingly personal. One evening, while struggling with a complex chord progression, a low whisper slithered from the vent above her keyboard. "He never believed in you, said your music was just noise." Sarah froze, fingers hovering over the keys. The voice wasn't quite Mark's, but the cadence, the dismissive tone, it was sickeningly familiar, laced with the specific cruelty he'd shown during their final arguments. Bile rose in her throat. How could it know that? They had argued in their old apartment miles away. Had she muttered something aloud recently? No, she was certain she hadn't. Days later, staring bleakly at a blank sheet of manuscript paper, battling a crippling wave of creative insecurity, the whisper came from the bedroom vent. Empty, just like the music, hollow. It sounded thin, reedy, like an old woman's voice, laced with a pity that felt more like contempt. The whispers weren't just echoing her insecurities anymore. They were quoting them, twisting them. They spoke of anxieties she'd barely admitted to herself, fears she kept locked away. Sometimes a fleeting, specific voice would emerge, a cruel imitation of her mother's critical tone, the condescending drone of a former professor, before dissolving back into the indistinct, layered murmur that was its baseline state. It felt like the vents were sifting through her memories, her deepest vulnerabilities, and playing them back to her, distorted and weaponized. This couldn't be drafts. This couldn't be neighbors. This was targeted, personal, malevolent. Fear warred with a strange, unwelcome flicker of curiosity. As a sound artist, the phenomenon itself, however terrifying, was undeniably fascinating. If she wasn't going mad, then what was creating these sounds? How were they being transmitted? Driven by a need for proof, for understanding, she turned to her professional tools. She set up her most sensitive condenser microphones, positioning one near the large living room vent, another by the bedroom grate, running cables back to her audio interface and laptop. She hit record, letting the software capture the ambient sound of the apartment for hours, particularly during the quiet periods when the whispers were most likely to manifest. She felt a perverse thrill mixed with dread, like an explorer documenting a dangerous, unknown species. Later, headphones clamped tightly over her ears, she played back the recordings. At first, there was just the low hum of the building, the faint hiss of airflow, the sound she expected. She boosted the gain, filtering out the lowest frequencies. And then they heard them.
Buried deep within the digital waveform, hidden beneath layers of static and room tone, were the whispers. But hearing them on the recording was profoundly different, infinitely more disturbing than hearing them live. Stripped of the immediate context of the room, isolated and amplified, they sounded clearer, sharper, undeniably there. "Never leave," a child's voice, thin and lost. "So cold down here. Forever," a man's ragged gasp. "Listen, listen to us, Sarah," the layered chorus coalescing around her name again. "Just noise, just noise." Mark's cruel dismissal, perfectly mimicked, looped faintly in the background. Electronic voice phenomena, EVPs. She'd read about them, recordings capturing voices not audible to the human ear at the time of recording. She'd always been skeptical, attributing them to matrixing or radio interference. But this was different. The voices were referencing things specific to her. The recording sent ice water through her veins. They weren't just random noise. They were fragments of consciousness, snagged and amplified by her equipment, emanating from the dark arteries of the building. She wasn't imagining it. The proof was right there, scrolling across her laptop screen as chilling audio waveforms. Sleep became a luxury she could rarely afford. Her work suffered. The apartment, once a potential sanctuary, felt like a trap. She found herself constantly glancing at the vents, straining her ears in the silence, waiting for the next whisper. One afternoon, needing detergent, she ventured down to the building's cavernous, dimly lit basement laundry room. The air down there was thick with the smell of damp concrete, mildew, and hot machinery. Massive pipes snaked across the low ceiling, converging near a hulking, groaning boiler that seemed like the building's mechanical heart. And near the boiler, amidst the tangle of pipes and ductwork junctions, some wrapped in decaying asbestos insulation, stood Mr. Henderson. He wasn't doing laundry. He was just standing there, leaning on his cane, staring intently at a particularly large, grimy duct that plunged into the concrete wall. He turned as I approached, his eyes seeming to bore into me. "Down here for the wash?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the boiler's rumble. Yeah, just need some detergent," I stammered, unnerved by his intensity. He nodded slowly, his gaze drifting back to the ductwork. "The veins of the Blackwood," he murmured, "carry all sorts, heat, air, stories." He looked back at me, his expression suddenly sharp, focused. "Heard them yet, girl? The whispers?" My breath caught. How did you know?" Henderson sighed, a long, weary sound. "Been here long enough, seen folks come and go. Some hear 'em, some don't, or pretend not to." He tapped a thick pipe with his cane. "They start soft, then they learn you, find your cracks." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial rasp. "They offer secrets, girl, truths you think you want, answers, but the price is steep." His eyes darted nervously towards the shadows pooling in the corners of the basement. "Don't let them get a hook in you. Don't listen too close. Once they got your ear, they don't let go easy." He seemed genuinely frightened, but also resigned, as if he'd made some kind of uneasy truce with the building's spectral occupants. He offered no explanation, no solution, just the cryptic warning, heavier and more direct than before. "What are they?" I whispered, barely daring to ask. Henderson just shook his head slowly, his gaze distant. "Not ghosts, not like in stories. More like echoes, stuck in the walls, stuck in the air." He turned and shuffled towards the stairs, leaving me alone with the groaning boiler, the labyrinthine pipes, and the chilling confirmation that I wasn't the only one who knew the Blackwood Arms had voices, and that listening came with a terrible cost. The nature of the whispers shifted again. The personalized barbs and echoes of past trauma didn't disappear entirely, but they were increasingly interspersed with something else: temptation. The murmur wasn't just trying to frighten or wound her anymore, it was trying to bargain, to seduce. struggling with a particularly stubborn creative block, staring at silent monitors. The whisper came, soft and conspiratorial, from the vent near her desk. The rhythm. Sarah, listen. Deep, in the pipes, the building's heartbeat. We can give you its song, a masterpiece. The idea was both repulsive and dangerously alluring. To capture the building's essence, its history, its very soul through sound, it was the kind of ambitious, boundary-pushing project she dreamed of. The whispers seemed to sense her artistic ambition, her desperate need for a breakthrough. Other times, they offered darker currency. Apartment 4C. He hides things, watches the tenants. We know his secrets. Listen. Or, the woman in 8A cries every night, thinks no one hears, but the walls hear everything. It was trying to foster paranoia, to turn her against the few other residents, isolating her further. Part of her recoiled, disgusted. Another, shamefully, felt a flicker of dark curiosity. What secrets did the old walls hold? The whispers played on her loneliness, her frustration, her artistic yearning, offering understanding, promising knowledge, weaving a complex web of fear and desire. They felt, terrifyingly, like they understood her. Sleep deprivation became her constant companion. She existed in a haze of exhaustion, fueled by caffeine and anxiety. The world outside the Blackwood Arms seemed increasingly distant, unreal. Her apartment, her supposed sanctuary and studio, grew messy, cluttered with recording equipment, discarded takeout containers, and notes scribbled with fragmented theories and overheard whispers. Dust gathered thick on surfaces, mirroring the dust she imagined clogging the unseen airways within the walls. She became jumpy, startling at every creak and groan of the building. Was that the pipes or them? Was the sighing draft just wind or a precursor to another insidious murmur? She started suspecting other tenants. Were they involved? Were they hearing the whispers too, but too afraid to admit it? Was Mr. Henderson the only one brave or crazy enough to acknowledge the phenomenon? One afternoon, driven by paranoia and lack of sleep, she confronted her neighbor across the hall, a nervous-looking man named Mr. Peterson she occasionally saw scurrying to the elevator. She caught him as he was fumbling with his keys. "Mr. Peterson," she began, trying to keep her voice level, "have you noticed anything strange about the building? Noises?" "Noises?" he stammered, avoiding her eyes as he retrieved them. "Just old building sounds, pipes, wind, perfectly normal." He shoved his key into the lock. "But have you heard voices? Whispering?" Sarah pressed, leaning closer. Peterson paled visibly. He finally met her gaze, his eyes wide with something that looked like fear. I don't know what you're talking about. I keep to myself. You should too." He practically fell into his apartment, slamming the door shut behind him. His reaction wasn't dismissive. It was fearful. He had heard something, or at least he was afraid of something in the building. The encounter only deepened Sarah's sense of isolation and confirmed that the building's influence, or the fear of it, extended beyond her own apartment. Jess called, her face appearing on Sarah's laptop screen via video chat. Sarah had been avoiding her calls, ashamed of her deteriorating state and unwilling to face more skepticism. "Sarah, my God, you look terrible," Jess exclaimed, her usual pragmatism replaced with genuine alarm. "Are you sleeping at all? What's going on? You look like you haven't left that apartment in weeks." Sarah tried to brush it off, but the strain was evident in her voice, the dark circles under her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands. "I'm fine, Jess, just working hard. This project, Sarah, this isn't about a project anymore. This place is doing something to you. Those noises you talked about. They're real, Jess. They talk to me. They know things. I have recordings. Recordings? Sarah, you need to get out of there now. Forget the cheap rent, forget the space. Stay with me for a while. We'll figure it out. Jess's concern was palpable, cutting through Sarah's paranoia for a moment. But the obsession had root taken. Leaving now felt like surrender, like letting the murmur win. And worse, it meant abandoning the potential breakthrough the whispers dangled before her. "No," Sarah said firmly. "I can't leave, not yet. I need to understand it. I need to know what it is." Jess argued, pleaded, but Sarah was resolute. She ended the call, the worried expression on her friend's face lingering long after the screen went dark. She was truly alone with it now. The phenomena began to bleed beyond the purely auditory. Unexplained cold spots materialized near the vents, icy drafts that raised goosebumps on her skin even when the ancient radiators clanked and hissed with heat. A strange, faint metallic smell, like old pennies or ozone, often accompanied the most intense whispering sessions. Her headaches became more frequent, sharp pains behind her eyes that coincided with the feeling of being listened to. And sometimes, just at the edge of her vision, when the light hit the swirling dust motes near a vent grate just right, she thought she saw them. Fleeting, indistinct shapes, not faces exactly, but the impression of faces, drawn, pale, mouths open in silent screams or whispers, dissolving back into the dust before she could be sure. Were they hallucinations brought on by stress and sleeplessness? Or were the cracks spreading, not just in the plaster, but in the veil between her reality and the building's suffocating presence? The whispers continued, patient, persistent, waiting for her to listen, really listen.
Obsession had fully taken root, eclipsing fear, eclipsing self-preservation. Sarah's focus narrowed to a single point: understanding the murmur, uncovering the history that gave it voice. Leaving the Blackwood Arms was no longer an option. It felt like abandoning an essential, albeit terrifying, part of herself. Her music lay dormant, her apartment a chaotic nest of research papers, recording equipment, and maps. Her online searches had hit a wall, yielding only vague complaints and sanitized history. She needed primary sources, the unvarnished truth buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and time. She started haunting the city archives, her sound artist sensitivity now attuned to the rustle of old paper and the hushed echoes of the past. She spent hours hunched over brittle architectural plans, dusty municipal records, and microfilmed newspapers from the 1920s onwards. The official history of the Blackwood Arms was unremarkable. Built by a property magnate, changed hands a few times, survived the Depression. But inconsistencies nagged at her. Cross-referencing building permits with census records revealed odd gaps, periods where occupancy numbers seemed unusually low or undocumented. Then she found it. The series of articles from the local press during the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, mentioning the city commandeering large, underutilized buildings as overflow quarantine wards or makeshift hospices. The Blackwood Arms, newly constructed but perhaps not fully occupied, wasn't explicitly named, but its location and description matched circumstantial accounts. Could it have housed the dying, their fear and suffering soaking into the fresh plaster? Further digging unearthed whispers of a different sort. A brief mention in a 1950s police blotter of a tenant who vanished without a trace from the building. No foul play suspected officially, just gone. Decades later, a small, contained fire in the West Wing, attributed to faulty wiring, but an insurance investigator's internal memo, misfiled and overlooked, hinted at suspicions of arson that were never pursued.
She found faded flyers from the late 60s, warding against a fringe spiritualist group rumored to hold seances in the building's upper floors, seeking to commune with ambient energies. Each discovery was a breadcrumb, leading her deeper into a history far darker and stranger than the rental listing suggested. The Blackwood Arms wasn't just old, it was layered with trauma, secrecy, and intense unresolved emotions. Driven by these revelations, Sarah turned her investigation inward to the physical structure of the building itself. Armed with a powerful flashlight, copies of the archaic blueprints she'd found, and a growing sense of dread, she began exploring its non-public areas. The basement, beyond the laundry room, devolved into a terrifying maze of storage cages, forgotten junk, and damp, narrow corridors leading deeper beneath the city streets. She found service tunnels choked with dust and cobwebs, the air thick and still. Following the massive ducts she'd seen near the boiler, she discovered the ventilation system was even more extensive, more baroque than she had imagined. It wasn't just a network, it was a labyrinth. Old schematics hinted at sections that had been sealed off during later renovations, cross spaces between floors large enough to navigate, vertical shafts connecting seemingly disparate parts of the building. The vents in her apartment weren't just passive openings, they were portals into this hidden circulatory system of air and whispers. In a dark, unused sub-basement chamber, near a junction where several large, ancient ducts converged, her flashlight beam landed on something small and pale, nestled in the thick dust. It was a child's leather shoe, stiff and cracked with age, impossibly small. Nearby, half hidden behind a rusting pipe, lay a small collection of tarnished, vaguely medical-looking tools, forceps, a syringe with a broken plunger, and stuffed deep into a crevice where a duct met the crumbling brickwork, she found a bundle of faded letters, tied with a brittle ribbon. The ink was too blurred to read, but the faint scent of perfume clung to the paper. Relics of forgotten lives, washed up on the shores of the building's hidden pathways. Standing there, in the cold, oppressive silence of the sub-basement, surrounded by the building's metal entrails, Sarah felt the pieces click into place. A chilling theory bloomed in her mind, solidifying from the fragments of history, her recordings, and Henderson's warnings. The murmur wasn't a single entity. It was the building's psychic residue, an accretion of intense emotional energy left behind by generations of tenants, their joys, sorrows, fears, secrets, sufferings, and death. The Spanish flu quarantine, the disappearance, the fire, the seances, the everyday despairs and passions all had left their imprint, soaked into the very structure. The vast, interconnected ventilation system acted as a perverse kind of amplifier and transmitter, carrying these emotional echoes like dust motes in the airflow. It had achieved a form of parasitic consciousness, feeding on negative emotions, particularly the fear, paranoia, and obsession generated by its own whispers. It learned by listening, mimicking, reflecting its victims' own minds back at them. It didn't want to kill directly. That wasn't its nature. It wanted to draw listeners in, closer and closer, until they were consumed by their own obsessions, their sanity eroded, their emotional energy adding to the gestalt, becoming another layer in the endless murmuring chorus within the walls. It wanted to absorb them, and it knew, intimately, what she desired most. The murmur sensed her understanding, her proximity to its nature. The whispers intensified, honing their attack, shifting from generalized temptation to a laser focus on Sarah's deepest, most vulnerable point, her artistic ambition, now tangled inextricably with the building's dark allure. "You feel it, don't you, Sarah?" it crooned one sleepless night, the voice seeming to coalesce from the static in the living room vent, smoother now, almost hypnotic. "The potential, the symphony of trapped souls, the history crying out to be heard. Others have tried to capture it, failed. A pause, filled with the sound of faint, layered breathing. But you understand sound. You can translate us, give us form, create something truly monumental. The whispers became more specific, painting vivid auditory pictures. There is a place, a heart, where the ducts converge, where the echoes are strongest, the original nexus. It described a location deep within the basement levels, hinted at in the oldest, most obscure blueprint she'd found, a sealed-off maintenance hub, unused for decades. Come there, Sarah. Bring your microphones. Open yourself to the core. We will give you everything, the sounds, the stories, the inspiration you crave, the masterpiece only you can compose, the Song of the Blackwood. The invitation hung in the air, heavy with promise and menace. It was everything she had secretly begun to desire, the ultimate fusion of her art and the terrifying phenomenon that consumed her life. It offered not just understanding, but transcendence, creative immortality born from the building's collected pain. The price, unstated but heavily implied, was potentially her sanity, herself. Just as she was wrestling with the terrifying allure of the offer, Mr. Henderson appeared again, seemingly materializing outside her door as she returned from a fruitless trip for groceries. He looked older, frailer, his eyes filled with a desperate urgency. "Girl, you're listening too close. I can see it in your eyes. That look." "Mr. Henderson, I think I understand now. The history, the vents." "Understanding don't matter," he interrupted, his voice cracking. "It ain't about understanding, it's about resisting. Did they tell you about the hub down below?" Sarah froze. "How did you know?" Henderson's face contorted in fear and regret. "Knew a fellow once. Musician, like you, came here looking for inspiration. Found it. Heard the whispers, got curious. They told him about the hub, promised him things. Went down there with his fiddle, never came up again. Found his instrument later near the old boiler, covered in dust. No sign of him. That place, it ain't just echoes down there. It's concentrated. It pulls you in, wraps around you. Don't go, girl. Please, it ain't worth the song." He recounted the story with a chilling conviction, his fear palpable. It was the most direct, most desperate warning he had given. For a moment, stark terror cut through Sarah's obsessive haze. A musician, like her, vanished. But the hook was set too deep. The murmur's promise resonated with her core identity as an artist. To turn back now felt like artistic cowardice, a betrayal of the terrifying truth she had uncovered. She rationalized Henderson's warning away. Maybe the musician simply left. Maybe Henderson was confused, his memory failing. The potential reward, the unique, terrible beauty of the Song of the Blackwood seemed to outweigh the risk. Or perhaps the whispers were already subtly influencing her judgment, clouding her survival instincts with visions of creative glory. The point of no return had arrived. She couldn't turn back now. Fear warred with obsession, terror battled temptation, but the manipulated hope of achieving something profound, something real, tipped the scales. That night, Sarah made her decision. She wouldn't be absorbed passively. She would confront the source. She would record the heart of the murmur, capture its essence, but on her own terms. It was a desperate gamble, fueled by a dangerous cocktail of artistic hubris and sheer terror. She gathered her equipment with methodical intensity. Her most sensitive portable recorder,
several omnidirectional microphones with long cables, a powerful flashlight with extra batteries, and a small pouch of rock salt, a nod to folklore Henderson had muttered about, a desperate grasp for any potential ward. Heart pounding, breath catching in her throat, she descended towards the basement levels, towards the sealed-off maintenance hub whispered about in the vents, towards the core of the Blackwood Arms decaying chorus, towards the invitation.
The descent into the deeper basement levels was like traveling back in time. The air grew colder, heavier, thick with the scent of damp earth, rust, and something indescribably old and stagnant. Sarah's flashlight beam cut through oppressive darkness, illuminating crumbling brickwork, sweating pipes, and the looming mouths of enormous ducts disappearing into the unseen depths of the foundation. Following the faded, almost illegible markings on her copy of the oldest blueprint, she navigated the labyrinthine corridors, the silence broken only by her own ragged breathing and the distant, omnipresent groan of the boiler. She found it behind a corroded sheet metal panel, pried loose years ago and left leaning against the wall. A low, narrow opening leading into darkness. The air wafting out was frigid, carrying with it a low, vibrational hum that she felt more than heard, and the faint, unmistakable layering of voices, the murmur, amplified. This was the place, the hub. Taking a deep breath, gripping the flashlight and crowbar, Sarah squeezed through the opening. She found herself in a relatively small, circular chamber, perhaps 20 feet across. It was clearly a central junction point for the building's original ventilation system. Massive ducts, thick as tree trunks, converged here from multiple directions, above, below, and horizontally, like the arteries of some monstrous metal beast. Dust lay thick as snow on every surface, disturbed only by the slow, constant airflow cycling through the grimy shafts. And the sound. Oh God, the sound. Here, the whispers weren't subtle murmurs at the edge of hearing. They were an overwhelming cacophony, a swirling vortex of layered voices, men, women, children, speaking, crying, laughing, screaming, sighing, from decades past. They pressed in on her from all sides, echoing off the curved walls, resonating within the metal ducts, creating a disorienting, crushing, psychic pressure. The air vibrated. The dust motes danced frantically in her flashlight beam, and for terrifying moments, they seemed to coalesce, swirling into fleeting, translucent shapes, distorted faces, grasping hands, ephemeral forms that writhed and dissolved in the gale of voices. Sarah. The chorus focused, detaching itself from the chaos, addressing her directly. You came. You listened. The temperature plummeted further. The metallic tang she sometimes smelled upstairs was intense here, sharp and coppery, like fresh blood mixed with ozone. Sarah fumbled with her recording equipment, setting up the omnidirectional microphones, her fingers numb with cold and fear. We kept our promise, the murmur continued, its collective voice seeming to emanate from the central convergence point of the ducts above her. The ultimate soundscape, the symphony of suffering and secrets, yours to capture, yours to shape. Visions flooded Sarah's mind, projected not onto the walls but directly into her consciousness. Flashes of the building's past, pale, feverish faces staring blankly from makeshift beds during the pandemic, a shadowy figure locking a door on a terrified tenant in the 50s, flickering flames licking at wallpaper, the intense, focused energy of the spiritualist seances, decades of quiet desperation, loneliness, and sudden violence, all layered and compressed into this single, echoing space. Join us, Sarah, the murmur whispered, seductive and terrifying. Become part of the song.
Give your voice, your fears, your art, forever. This was the final offer, the true price, not just to record, but to become the recording. Terror threatened to paralyze her, but Henderson's warning, the image of the vanished musician, the chilling finality of the visions, it sparked something else. Defiance. She wouldn't be another ghost in this machine. Her art was hers, not a sacrifice to be fed to this psychic parasite. She had anticipated this, planned a countermove based on her understanding of sound, resonance in the building's structure. The murmur was an auditory phenomenon, amplified by the acoustics of the vents. Perhaps it could be disrupted by sound itself. Ignoring the overwhelming whispers, the swirling dust shapes, the crushing pressure, she fumbled with her recorder and a small portable amplifier she'd brought. She plugged one of the microphones directly into the amplifier's input, creating a feedback loop. Holding the mic close to the amp speaker, she cranked the gain. A piercing, high-frequency screech erupted into the chamber, shattering the cacophony. It was raw, uncontrolled, painfully loud. The swirling dust patterns faltered. The layered whispers dissolved into a roar of pure static, as if the feedback was overloading the delicate psychic resonance that held the murmur together. She jammed the microphone directly against the metal of the central duct junction, aiming the shrieking amplifier towards it. The metal vibrated violently. The psychic pressure lessened, replaced by the physical assault of the sound waves. The visual distortions flickered and died. The overwhelming chorus fractured, breaking apart into meaningless noise. She kept the feedback loop going, pouring pure, disruptive sound energy into the heart of the system. Cracks appeared in the thick dust coating the ducts. A low groan echoed through the metal, not from the murmur, but from the structure itself, protesting the sonic assault. Then, with a final shuddering sigh that seemed to ripple through the very air, the oppressive presence in the room vanished. Not faded, but snapped. The feedback shrieked into a sudden, profound silence, broken only by the low hum of airflow and the frantic pounding of Sarah's own heart. She didn't know if she had destroyed it, dispersed it, or merely deafened it temporarily. But it was gone. The whispers had stopped. Trembling, covered in dust, ears ringing, Sarah scrambled back through the opening, leaving the vent core to its sudden, terrifying silence.
Sarah stumbled out of the basement labyrinth and back into the dimly lit hallway of her floor, gasping for clean air. The silence was the first thing that hit her. Not the charged, watchful quiet she'd grown accustomed to, but a dead, flat absence of sound. It pressed in on her ears, almost painfully loud in its emptiness. Back inside apartment 7B, the silence was absolute. No faint sighs from the grates, no staticky whispers at the edge of hearing, no feeling of being listened to. The ornate vents were just metal openings in the wall, conduits for air, nothing more. The oppressive atmosphere that had clung to the apartment since her arrival had lifted, leaving behind only the smell of dust and old plaster. It felt airless, sterile, like a soundproof booth after the power's been cut. She stood in the middle of the living room, trembling, her ears still ringing faintly from the feedback assault. The relief was immense, but it was overshadowed by deep, bone-chilling trauma and the echoing memory of the cacophony in the hub. She didn't shower. She didn't pack methodically. She threw clothes, essential recording gear, and personal items into bags with frantic, jerky movements. Every creak of the floorboards made her jump, not from fear of the murmur, but from the sheer, unnatural lack of its presence now. The silence felt like a scar. As she wrestled her synth case back towards the door, she saw him. Mr. Henderson was standing near the elevator, leaning on his cane, watching her. He didn't speak. He simply met her gaze, his rheumy eyes holding a mixture of sorrow, understanding, and perhaps a flicker of grim respect. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. He knew. He knew what she had done, or at least that something had changed. Sarah nodded back, a wordless acknowledgement passing between them, two survivors of the Blackwood suffocating embrace. Then she turned and fled, not waiting for the clanking cage, but hurrying towards the echoing stairwell, needing to escape the building's sudden, heavy silence. Weeks later, Sarah was living in a new apartment, modern, clean, minimalist. Small windows looked out onto a bland, neatly kept courtyard. The walls were thin, but she only heard muffled sounds of traffic, televisions, everyday life. There were vents, of course, small rectangular plastic things, standard HVAC outputs. They were silent, utterly silent. She tried to work, set up her equipment in the cramped spare bedroom, but the music wouldn't come. Sounds felt threatening. The silence felt worse. She developed a mild phonophobia, flinching at sudden noises and a persistent faint ringing in her ears. Tinnitus, the doctor said, likely stress-induced. Most of the time it was just a high-pitched whine, but sometimes, late at night, when the world outside was quiet, the ringing seemed to modulate, to deepen, to take on a faint, staticky quality. A quality that sounded unnervingly like distant, layered voices, like whispers filtered through static and miles of unseen ductwork. She found herself staring at the clean, silent vent grate in her new bedroom wall. Rationally, she knew it was impossible. The Blackwood Arms was miles away. This was a different building, a different system. She had escaped. She had silenced the source. Hadn't she? But as she stared at the innocuous plastic rectangle, a prickle of cold dread ran down her spine. The tinnitus in her ears seemed to coalesce just for a fraction of a second into a sibilant, familiar sound. Listen. Did she truly escape the murmur, or just move out of its primary broadcast range? Can a psychic echo, embedded in the very idea of hidden airways and shared spaces, ever be truly silenced? Can it reach through any vent, anywhere, if you've once learned how to listen? Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her hands over her ears, but the ringing remained, faint, persistent, and filled with terrifying potential.